Wow, what an awesome song. So I'm back. Good morning, everyone. When Reverend Jason invited me to give the sermon to you today, I had some idea of what I wanted to talk to you about. My original thought for this sermon was to explore the idea of collective narrative, to explore the stories we tell about ourselves and the impact that those stories have on our lives and on our world. In particular, I think it's important to understand the way narratives held by some communities can blind them to the narratives of others. And it's particularly critical for communities of power and privilege to understand how the stories they tell about themselves affect their actions toward disenfranchised communities, or more to the point, to the communities they disenfranchise. I think it's safe to say that white America is starting to challenge the narratives told about the birth of this country and the harm they continue to cause to this very day. In a similar way, increasing numbers of us in the Jewish community are now starting to confront the Zionist narrative that has been instilled in us for the past 73 plus years. Much like the American narrative, it is also one that is rooted in colonialism and racism. It's the story of a nation created on the backs of a dispossessed and disenfranchised people. Hence the original title of my sermon, When Narratives Collide. Given the events of this past week, however, the terrible, tragic events that are still ongoing in Israel-Palestine, I've decided to address this issue in a more immediate way and a more personal way. There is, of course, so much to say about the current moment: the evictions of Palestinian families in East Jerusalem, Israel's attack on the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the escalating violence between Jews and Palestinians in Israel proper. However, this morning, I want to talk to you about Gaza. I've chosen this particular subject because that's where the greatest and most tragic violence is occurring right now. I also want to talk to you about Gaza because I believe it epitomizes the ways Israel's national narrative has inflicted harm on Palestinians and how it continues to inflict harm so tragically, even as we speak. I've also chosen to talk about Gaza because it has a special place in my own heart. In 2008, Israel launched a military operation on Gaza known as Operation Cast Lead, not unlike the one we are witnessing at this very moment. This event became a pivotal turning point in my own relationship to Israel-Palestine and to Zionism in general. By the end, in early 2009, the Israeli military killed over 1,300 Palestinians during Operation Cast Lead, including 300 children. In addition to these horrific casualties, it was the response of many in my Jewish community that shook me to my core. The rationalizations, the moral equivocation, the inability to face the wider context in which these actions were occurring, the vilification of those, including many reputable human rights organizations, who suggested that Israel's actions constituted war crimes and even crimes against humanity. Then it happened again in 2014. The Israeli military killed over 2,000 Palestinians, 495 of whom were children. And now today, Israel is once again unleashing overwhelming military firepower against a population of almost 2 million people, whom they've literally blockaded in a tiny strip of land and who literally have nowhere to run. This is not a complicated moral calculus for me anymore, as a rabbi, as a Jew, and as a human being of conscience. Like many American Jews, my identity growing up was profoundly informed by the classic Zionist narrative. I identified with Israel as a Jewish state for most of my life. I've spent a great deal of time there. I have many dear friends there. And it's that story, the story of a small underdog nation forging a national and cultural rebirth out of the ashes of its near destruction. It's that redemptive nature of this narrative that has at times assumed a quasi-sacred status for me, as it has for many Jews of my generation and older. Politically speaking, I've identified with what tends to be referred to today as liberal Zionism. I've been inspired in the past by Israel's labor Zionist origins, and I generally align myself with positions advocated by the Israeli left and the Israeli peace movement. When it came to the ongoing conflict with Palestinians, I would advocate for peace, of course, but I'd also intone a very familiar refrain that's very common to liberal Zionists, quote unquote, "it's complicated." In 2008, however, I reacted with something of a tipping point. I read about the bombing of schools. I read about whole families being wiped out, children literally burned to the bone with white phosphorus. Somehow it didn't seem so complicated to me anymore. At long last, it felt as if I was viewing the conflict with something approaching clarity. Now, technically, of course, the situation in Israel-Palestine is enormously complicated, as all political conflicts are. But at the end of the day, there is nothing complicated about persecution. And if there's anything complicated for the Jewish community, of which I'm a part, it's in the possibility that we might, in fact, have become oppressors ourselves. That is painfully complicated. After all, our Jewish identity has been bound up with the memory of our own persecution for centuries. How on earth can we respond, let alone comprehend, the suggestion that we've become our own worst nightmare? My relationship to Gaza deepened yet further in 2017, when I visited Gaza as a staff person for the American Friends Service Committee to meet with our programmatic staff there. I worked for the AFSC for 5 years between 2014 and 2019. I don't know any other way to say it other than that I now take Gaza very, very personally, having visited there and spent time there. I've been indelibly transformed by my experience of that place, by friendships that I cherish to this very day. And as a result, it has given me an even deeper sensitivity into a narrative about Gaza that is too often hideously twisted, even by the most well-meaning of people. And I have to say, I am in very deep anguish about my friends and have been texting and messaging them desperately to find out if they're okay and if their families are okay. And so far, thank God, as far as right now, I think that is the case. Too often, I believe, we tend to fetishize Gaza and Gazans, describing them either as murderous terrorists, helpless pawns of Hamas, or poor passive victims. And since most people only tend to think of Gaza at moments such as these, when the bombs are falling, that this is about as generally as far as its public image tends to go. Gaza becomes an objectified symbol of people's fears, their political agendas, and their own internalized prejudices. Since that time, it's been something of a personal mission of mine to try and expand the one-dimensional narrative that is routinely told about Gaza, to contextualize Gaza's history with information that is virtually unknown to most of the world, but is absolutely critical if we want to understand Gaza in a three-dimensional, non-objectified way. I also see it as something of a personal mission to shine a light on the moral and religious challenge that Gaza presents to the Jewish community and to all people of conscience. So indulge me now in a short geographic tutorial. What we call the Gaza Strip constitutes a 140 square mile piece of land on the southeastern Mediterranean coast. While we generally think of Gaza as this one little crowded landmass, this term historically has referred to a much larger territory that has been continuously inhabited for over 3,000 years. In ancient times, it enjoyed extensive commerce and trade with the outside world and was, for a very long time, a major port and an important stop along the spice and incense routes. As such, it was located at a significant cultural crossroad, connecting a wide variety of different civilizations over the centuries. Today, of course, if folks associate Gaza with anything at all, it's not with this rich cultural history. It's with refugees and refugee camps. But it's important to bear in mind that this is a relatively recent phenomenon in its history. The so-called Gaza Strip was created in 1949 when it became the repository for a flood of Palestinian refugees from cities and villages who had been expelled from their homes by Zionist militias. By the outset of the war, the population of this small strip of land numbered anywhere from 60 to 80,000 people. By the end of the hostilities, at least 200,000 refugees were crowded into what we today call the Gaza Strip. The borders of this area were drawn arbitrarily, determined by the position of Egyptian and Israeli forces when the ceasefire was announced in 49. And then it ended up being smaller by at least a third than the entire area of the Gaza district during the British Mandate. At the time, most of the refugees there fully expected to return home. Some could even see their own towns and villages through the barbed wire fences. But those who crossed the border to gather their possessions or to harvest their crops were considered, quote, infiltrators by Israel and shot on sight. Eventually, it became all too clear there would be no return. Over the years, the refugee tents turned into concrete buildings that grew ever higher in that narrow corridor. The numbers of that once sparse territory has now grown to a population of almost 2 million people. And the majority of them are not originally from Gaza. They're from historic Palestine. Given this context, it was natural that Gaza would become a center for the Palestinian resistance movement. We know from history that when a people are oppressed, they will inevitably resist their oppression. And yes, sometimes that resistance will be violent in nature. It's important to note that despite its political rhetoric, Israel understands this full well and has for the past 73 years. I want to read to you just a brief excerpt from a eulogy that was given by Moshe Dayan, who is a famous Israeli military general and politician. This was a eulogy for a young kibbutznik named Roy Rotenberg, who was killed by a Palestinian in 1956, who infiltrated from the Strip to a kibbutz that was located on the border between what became Israel and Gaza. He spoke very powerfully and actually very candidly at Rotenberg's funeral. And I really want you to note these remarks. This is a fairly famous speech for those of us who are familiar with Israeli and Zionist history. He said, "Do not today besmirch the murderers with accusations. Who are we that we should bewail their mighty hatred of us? For 8 years, they sat in refugee camps in Gaza, and opposite their gaze, we appropriate for ourselves as our own portion the land and the villages in which they and their fathers dwelled. This we know, that in order that the hope to destroy us should die, we have to be armed and ready morning and night. We are a generation of settlement, and without a steel helmet and the barrel of a cannon, we cannot plant a tree and build a house. Our children will not live if we do not build shelters, and without a barbed wire fence and a machine gun, we cannot pave a road and channel water. The millions of Jews that were destroyed because they did not have a land look at us from the ashes of Israelite history and command us to take possession of and establish a land for our nation." End quote. That was 1956. And today, 2021, Israel continues to rule with barbed wire fences and the barrel of a gun. And just as powerfully, the descendants of the original Gazan refugees have lost none of their ancestors' desire for return. Most of them know full well where their ancestral homes and fields are located. In some cases, just a few short kilometers from where they currently live. As in other parts of Palestine, the memory of home and the desire for return are a palpable part of Gazan culture. I experienced this in a simple yet powerful way during my visit there. One afternoon, we were traveling north along the coast from Rafah to Gaza City, and I noticed a series of colorful concrete benches along the waterfront. My Gazan colleague Ali explained to us that each one of those benches bore the name on the back of a Palestinian city or town or village where Gazans had lived prior to 1948. It's not difficult to grasp the sacred significance of these simple seaside benches to the refugees of Gaza. Unlike most memorials, which commemorate what was lost and is never to be found, I'd wager that those who come to these beaches don't believe that their homes, cities, and villages are lost at all. On the contrary, I believe these benches testify to the fact that these places are still very real to them, and to their faith that they will one day return home. I want to quote to you just a brief quote from an article that was written by a dear friend of mine, Jihad Abu Salim, who is a Gazan who lives in Chicago now. He was a colleague of mine when I worked at AFSC, and his family actually has roots in Gaza. He is not a refugee, but actually has very, very deep roots, familial roots in Gaza. And he wrote this 2 years ago during the Great March of Return. These were weekly demonstrations by Palestinians that were met with live ammunition fire every Friday afternoon in Israel, Palestine. He wrote, "Our message is that we are human beings. Despite 70 years of exile, 50 years of occupation, and 11 years of a blockade, we can still carry signs in Arabic, Hebrew, and English that say, we are not coming to fight, we are coming to return to our lands. Gazans who saw wars and blood, who lost relatives to groves and prisons, who have 4 hours of electricity, who are besieged and tired, these Gazans still have faith that the international community cares. Will the rest of humanity hear them?" End quote. When we consider the narrative of Gaza, I hope we can keep this critical piece of context in mind. Long before there was Hamas, Palestinians in Gaza have been resisting their oppression, and Israel has been retaliating against their resistance. Of course, when we do the moral calculus, we can argue about the strategic and moral sense of these rockets that Hamas is firing into Israel, as many Palestinians do. But if we truly seek to understand Gaza's narrative, we must honestly ask ourselves, what would we ourselves do in their situation? As I noted earlier, many white Americans are starting to reckon seriously with the colonial narratives instilled about the birth of this country. The narratives of the powerful and the privileged have great power, but when they collide with the narratives of those they've disenfranchised, the impact can sometimes create a spark of transformation. It can indeed lead to the writing of a new narrative. The Black Lives Matter protests that were born last summer is a powerful example of this phenomenon. I think we've all been astonished and inspired by a new narrative that's struggling to be born in this country. I fervently believe there is potential for a similar transformation in Israel-Palestine. It will not happen easily or painlessly, but I do believe it can happen, and in a very real sense, it has to happen. I want to conclude for you now with a piece of liturgy that I wrote in 2008, back during Operation Cast Lead. It happened in the late summer and fall. I'm sorry, this is 2014. It happened in the late summer and fall during a holiday in the Jewish community known as Tisha B'Av, where we read the Book of Lamentations. And so I reworked the words of the first chapter of Lamentations to fit that current moment of what was going on in Gaza. Those of you who are familiar with the Book of Lamentations know that it is a very raw book. It is a very deep, tragically raw book, probably the most painful book in the Bible to read. And these words that I'm about to read to you reflect both that rawness and also the sense of anguish that so many of us, increasingly in the Jewish community, were experiencing at that time and are experiencing even at this time as Israel's military assault on Gaza continues and hopefully will end soon. Gaza weeps alone, bombs falling without end, her cheeks wet with tears, a widow abandoned, imprisoned on all sides, with none willing to save her. We who once knew oppression have become the oppressors. Those of us who have been pursued are now the pursuers. We have uprooted families from their homes. We have driven them deep into this desolate place, this narrow strip of exile. All along the roads, there is mourning. The teeming marketplaces have been bombed into emptiness. The only sounds we hear are cries of pain, sirens blaring, drones buzzing, bitterness echoing into the black vacuum of homes destroyed and dreams denied. We have become Gaza's master, leveling neighborhoods with the mere touch of a button for her transgression of resistance. Her children are born into captivity. They know us only as occupiers, enemies to be feared and hated. We have lost all that once was precious to us. This fatal attachment to our own might has become our downfall. This idolatrous veneration of the land has sent us wandering into a wilderness of our own making. We have robbed Gaza of her deepest dignity, plunged her into sorrow and darkness. Her people crowd into refugee camps, held captive by fences and buffer zones, gunboats, mortar rounds, and Apache missiles. We sing of Jerusalem to a free people in our own land, but our song has become a mockery. How can we sing a song of freedom, imprisoned inside walls and bomb shelters that we have built with our own fear and dread? Here we sit clinging to our illusions of comfort and security while we unleash hell on earth on the other side of the border. We sit on hillsides as our explosions light up the sky, while far below, whole neighborhoods are reduced to rubble. For these things I weep, for the toxic fear we have unleashed from the dark places of our hearts, for the endless grief we are inflicting on the people of Gaza. I want to thank you for listening. I realize that these words I am offering you are painful and not easy to hear. And I also realize that not everyone who I'm speaking to may agree with everything I've said, but I am honored to be with your congregation. I was very deeply moved to be asked to speak to you. I did not expect to be speaking about this, but I do hope that this will be the beginning of a conversation of our respective communities, of the individuals within our respective communities, that we may reckon with all of these narratives that have been colliding both in this country, in Israel, Palestine, and so many places, too many places around the world, that we might lead us all to a better narrative, a narrative of transformation and justice for all who dwell on earth.